This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Brian Smith about his new book, Walker Percy and the Politics of the Wayfarer. I am excited to introduce to our listening audience that Brian Smith will be the new managing editor of Law and Liberty, so we're glad to have him on the program for that and to talk Walker Percy. So, Brian, we're glad you're here.
Thanks for having me.
So thinking about Walker Percy, I mean, a lot of people have heard of him, know of him, think of him maybe as a Southern novelist, a Catholic novelist. Your book, Politics of the Wayfarer, I think is an interesting part of the title. So maybe sketch for us, who was Walker Percy? Why should we read him?
So Walker Percy was born in 1916 to a Southern family of a long line of depressives. He was orphaned early in life and ended up living with his now not very famous, but probably should be more, uncle named William Alexander Percy, who was a poet and lawyer. He wrote after succumbing to tuberculosis after medical school. He started writing novels, and his novels get at what it means to be human in really complicated times. You know, he tells us what it means to be a American living in the richest country in the world, and tries to get at what is it about Americans that are so depressed? Why are we so miserable despite being so affluent? And he gets at some of the manias of American life, our tendency to seek comfort and aim at wealth instead of addressing our need for community and family life. I think these are all things that, particularly now in America, being sort of politically frayed and medicated for depression more than ever, these are things that speak to our experience right now as people in need of a home.
So in introducing you, you're from California, Georgetown PhD. You've been associate professor in political science department at Montclair State University. How did you become interested in Walker Percy? I say that as I'm a Southerner. I sort of naturally acclimated to Walker Percy. And when I read his descriptions of Southern dialect and the way Southerners relate to one another in the novels, it really spoke to me. You are from Southern California by way of Georgetown in New Jersey. Talk about your connection and how you got interested in Percy. And I guess as I ask that question, I suppose is he just this thing, this Southern Catholic writer that we hear so much about?
He's absolutely not just a Southern writer. In fact, he hated being called a Southern writer. He had this self-interview in 1977 with Esquire where he basically said, "Stop asking me about the South. I don't want to talk about that anymore." But about me, a friend of mine in grad school suggested I read Love in the Ruins, I think in my second or third year of grad school. And what really spoke to me as I read the novel and I started digging into Percy's essays is this is a guy that gets what it means to be someone who was born in one place, moved to the other side of the country, billiard balled around the country, doing different things. And he speaks to the need of relating to people in a place. And I found that as someone who was very nervous about the trends in social science and the way politics is studied professionally, Percy addresses all of these complaints about what it means to be a student of society and gets at the things that social scientists often get wrong. And for me, as someone who was learning how to be a scholar, I found some of his criticisms really helpful for understanding how I could write about contemporary questions without sort of falling off a cliff of statistics and formal methodologies, and also without losing sight of people and what their actual experiences are.
Walker Percy, we could say, in certain respects, misplaced early in life, studies to become a doctor, Columbia Medical School, if that's right.
Yeah, yeah.
And then contracts tuberculosis, or form of tuberculosis, in studying the cadavers from Skid Row, I think in New York. Has that experience and can no longer be a physician because of that, and recovers from his TB in New Mexico. For a spell, also misses World War II.
Right,
can't fight in World War II, a not insignificant part of a man's life at that period, and but he's also a man of means, given his family history, and we can talk about his family's history, which is interesting and storied, and sort of has to, what am I going to do? And of course, this is sort of a hell, infinite possibility. What particular path, what particular meaning for my life should I choose?
Yeah, when he was first diagnosed with tuberculosis, and back up a sec, he chose pathology, but the other discipline he was weighing was psychiatry. He was already interested in questions of the nature of the human being, how we relate in the world. He'd been depressed throughout his time in New York before the war even started. But missing out on the war, and originally he was at a sanitarium in New York, laid up, all he could do was read. And he began exploring these questions of what does it mean to be a person? He started reading German existentialism, novels of Dostoevsky, the other French existentialists. He started sort of exploring these hints about what we might do to cope with our condition. And the thing was, he had been drawn to medicine, not particularly because he wanted to be a doctor who made money and all of this. His guardian had suggested that he needed to join a profession. It's part of his interesting family background. Will Percy, said that you should basically become a lawyer, join the military, or become a doctor. He chose medicine. And he did it because he was attracted to the clarity and elegance of science. So he understands the appeal of these sort of abstract theories of how evolution works, how our brains operate, and why people get sucked into those and think that they can explain everything about the world. But in some ways, it took him being knocked on his back for tuberculosis to start asking other questions about the meaning of human life. It led him to a conversion to Catholicism in 1946. And I think all of these things together set him on a path of, initially, because he had these family means, he was able to spend 10 years doing research into different things as an autodidact. He wrote a number of very interesting essays on the philosophy of language and language learning. And that was what brought him to the point of being able, I think, that and reading all of these novels, to write these penetrating stories that sort of bring us to an awareness of ourselves. And The Moviegoer was the first one. It came out 55, I think.
52, wasn't it? It won the National Book Award,
yes.
I think, or was a finalist for the National Book Award in
He won it.
1952. He won.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the photograph. Thinking about your book, in particular, The Politics of the Wayfarer. And you've edited a collection of essays with the late Peter Lawler, the political companion to Walker Percy, published by University Press of Kentucky. Thinking about, though, your book, The Politics of the Wayfarer, I don't associate Walker Percy as a very political thinker or a partisan. I think he voted for Ronald Reagan. I know that. I think he also voted for JFK, not surprising. Mm-hmm. But I don't. So help us understand what does it mean to be the politics of the Wayfarer, which I think is also interesting because in America we have certain strains. We have an individualist strain. Right. We have a progressive strain. We also have this thing after World War II, the conservative movement. So how do you fit Percy into all of that?
Let's start with the Wayfarer bit.
Yeah.
Percy's philosophical obsession was to understand human beings as not at home in this world, figure out ways to understand how we could navigate this life, and all the tools we'd use to navigate, to find satisfaction and comfort. He understands them to all be limited. Now, for him as a Catholic, the facts of existence are best explained by the Christian story, but his concern was that even our churches, they're run by sinful human beings, and they become, in some ways, they can become, the communities around them can become sort of snares for living well. And so when I talk about, figuring out what it means to be a political person in this, you have to understand that man is not meant to be at home in this world in Percy's understanding. So all of our ways of navigating are going to have to be very circumspect. And that's not something Americans, like think here of Tocqueville, are really prone to do. We oscillate between extremes of really engaging in the world furiously and then getting disappointed by that and then running back home. And as a matter of politics, I think Percy's story is one of moderation, sticking to principle, knowing. So we want to have people bound into their communities, affiliated with churches, and active as citizens, but locally, and not agitating on behalf of isms of one kind or another. In one of his novels, he has this. He has one of his characters, I think Will Barrett, sort of go on this monologue about how he rejects all the isms of the world because the isms of the world are death. And I think the problem is with an ism, you can get bound up with causes in a way that I think leaves you defenseless against that ism taking a setback in the world.
Yeah, I think as I read Percy, particularly say a novel like Love in the Ruins, it's the ism or the ideology provides one with enormous clarity and objectivity on a set of political, economic, legal issues, but that comes at the expense of reality. Of complexity, of understanding how difficult people are.
Yeah.
And also comes at the expense of marginalizing particular people who disagree with you. And then inevitably the world doesn't work according to the ideology, and that leads to cynicism, despair, sadness.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, Peter Lawler had this line that, Percy was the greatest inheritor of the tradition of Alexis de Tocqueville. And I think that's absolutely right. And it shows up in funny places in Percy's writing. He has this, in the self-interview I mentioned earlier, he has this moment where he talks about how the solution to, if you could even call it a solution, to racial tension might be PTA meetings where whites and blacks gather around a table at a crawfish boil and eat and talk together and share their lives, not trying to get over police brutality and Black Lives Matter and the big issues of the day, but indirectly, that we learn to respect one another as people by just muddling through our lives and navigating the practical issues of things like a school board meeting. And that, not to say that the tension won't occur in those places, but that in some ways the path to addressing the major social and political issues of the day has to come through face-to-face conversation for him. So, if there's an ism you can ascribe to Percy, that it's the local. It's being local in our understanding of things.
And in one respect, it's thoroughly American, the idea of deliberative democracy.
Right, but not the deliberative democracy you hear in political theory, where it's this very abstract, high-level conversation about ideal speech situations where we strip out what's essential to us for someone like Percy.
Well, and it's also, I'm being a little bit sarcastic here. The idea of dialogue is talking with the progressive expert until you agree with the progressive expert, and then dialogue has been achieved.
Absolutely. And the irony here is that a handful of progressives get this. You could see interviews with Cornel West even, where he says that the thing about the abstract situation is that I can't love you as a neighbor. I can't get to know your faults and know the particularities of your existence. So, for him, that's a story about why we can't be colorblind. And I actually think Percy agrees with that. You can't be colorblind. You have to know where people are coming from and try to navigate that. Where I think Percy, departs from, call it social justice Christians of that kind, is that this is not going to be the government that gets us out of the fixes we're in. It is going to be citizens coming together around coffee tables, at PTA meetings, muddling through issues, and I think coming to an understanding of what it means to live together in a community.
So let's talk more. You raised this idea of being at home in the world, and Percy very much influenced by Gabriel Marcel's book early in his reading Homo Viator, and this idea of we're actually not supposed to be that comfortable in the world. There are compensations, but problems always intrude, and Percy had several, I think, just choice observations. Modernity is the place where man has labored incessantly through technology, through science, through government, economics, to make himself entirely at home in the world, and yet is more violent, death-haunted,
miserable,
disturbed than ever. And how do you make sense of that? But that of course ties into something Tocqueville understood about the America he observes. And so this question of the middle class democracy, the middle class democracy with technology, we're always seeking our best ends, we're always pursuing our self-interest, and yet missing our very selves. I mean, this is maybe you think about some of his novels where I think we see this to be the case. One that occurs to me is Love in the Ruins, which is, I think that's really become my favorite novel.
It's hilarious. I mean, it's funny.
And we have there with Love in the Ruins, we have the physician who keeps missing himself, an alcoholic. His wife has left him. She's in pursuit. Maybe we could talk about this. This is another part of Percy's diagnosis of modernity, the need for. It could be psychology, it could be various spiritual or say Eastern religions rotated in the West and a Western understanding. This idea to get beyond my predicament through those methodologies, and this is all sort of at play. And then Percy, his character, Tom Moore, is his name, invents the qualitative, quantitative, ontological lapsometer. Maybe just sort of sketch all that for us, because it's beautiful.
So the setup of the novel is Tom Moore lives in Feliciana Parish in
an upper class
suburb of distant New Orleans. It's made up, it's not a real place,
but it's Louisiana.
It's somewhere in Louisiana. In Percy's imagination. It's a very affluent place,
apocalyptic America.
So if you do the math, the novel is set in 1983.
That's right.
No, 1984. Sorry, because he meant to do this with Orwell. It's 1984, and it starts, I think, July 1st, and it goes for 4 days in 1984. But he wrote it in the late 60s. It's meant to be this sort of future dystopian-ish story. And Tom Moore is sort of sitting in this abandoned motel, thinking he's under sniper fire, waiting things out and asking himself, well, has it ended? Has America fallen apart? And then the novel predicts, America being split between two parties, the former Democratic Party, the left Papa Sane, which is like, what is it? Leftism, euthanasia, abortion, the pill. I forget the rest of it's an acronym. And the knotheads.
The knotheads, which
former,
came from a Goldwater quotation, I think.
No man could be too knotheaded, in service to his country. And read now, it seems like a very apt description of where the parties are at. But Percy meant this so you've got the center hollowed out in America. You've got these characters sort of totally enmeshed in their own personal projects of seeking prosperity, and everyone is crazier than ever. So enter Tom Moore. He's a 40-ish doctor. He has he's lost his wife and daughter. The daughter died of a neuroblastoma a few years before the novel is set, and in the wake of the daughter's illness, his wife Doris tries to abandon Western ideals and find herself in a Eastern mystic cult. In essence, it reads like the story of Elizabeth Gilbert, the Eat, Pray, Love woman.
I've never thought of that comparison. That's right on.
Except it ends more badly. Doris dies on the island of Cozumel in some accident, and Tom is left by himself. He's an alcoholic. He has a breakfast concoction of vodka, duck eggs, and Tang powder in his morning drink, and he's obsessed with using this ontological lapsometer, a neurological reading device that can tell how we're feeling. It can tell how our moods correlate to our neurological state. And he finds himself in this position where he's got this world-shattering invention, he thinks, and this satanic figure from the government, Art Immelman, comes to offer him a means of turning it into a treatment tool. And mad hijinks ensue. He has 3 love interests, all much younger ladies. This might be a bit of wish fulfillment on Percy's part. And things go awry from there. But what I think Tom Moore finds over the course of the story is that his science is not enough. He's brought to the end of himself by crisis. And this recurs in a lot of Percy's novels. He depicts these completely lost figures who need a shock to see that the path of modern American theorizing about the world and sort of falling into grand self-help plans or Eastern mysticism and the consumption we think we find satisfaction in, the expensive vacations, the maxing out of credit cards, the nice fancy cars, none of those are fulfilling. His characters are often very materially fulfilled people, but miserable. And Tom Moore, I think, is just the best and most vivid of all of them, with maybe the exception of Bink Spalling in The Moviegoer, his first novel. But everyone should go read Love in the Ruins. William F. Buckley actually said that it was the perfect introduction for understanding America in the post-Vietnam world, that the President of the United States should read that novel and take an oath to using it to help understand.
It was certainly, in the novel, I'm listening to you, in the novel, the President is a Southern Baptist and the Vice President is a Mormon.
Right.
And they're the knotheads, and they are, and with the center being hollowed out.
Yes.
I mean, that's obviously front and center in our day. Thinking about the novel, I always like the way it ended. So you mentioned the 3 love interests. One is Ellen Oglethorpe, right. The daughter of Presbyterian missionaries who has lost her Calvinist faith, but retains all of the virtue, the duty, the obligations, and he ends up marrying her.
Right.
They have 2 small children, and they live on the bayou. Right. At Novel's End, and he is in former slave quarters,
which he's renovated a bit. Yeah,
and he's a doctor, not terribly successful, and in the area he lives in, owing to various economic changes, the black population has become quite successful, right. and they sort of treat Tom Moore, turnabout happens, and so he finds happiness in this. He talks about buying a mattress.
That's a big
like
Christmas
that.
present.
Yeah, exactly.
But so the other thing that's important to note is it's 5 years after the end of the novel. So here we are. They've married. They've had 2 kids. He runs in the morning along the bayou instead of having his vodka, Tang, and
he runs a
duck
trot
eggs.
line.
Yeah,
yeah.
He runs a clinic for weight control for the black ladies of Feliciana Parish, but he runs his practice for all the poor white folk. He says that he, as poor as he is, he feels like God's spoiled little child. That he has this idea of still using the lapsometer, but doesn't think it can transform the world anymore. He doesn't think that he can use it as some mind-altering controlling device, which I didn't mention earlier, but that's this sort of dystopian element of the novel.
I want to get into
that. This lapsometer, since after this little addition that government figure gives him, this little hint about how to make it work, it becomes a potential tool of zapping people out of their depression, making them kind of perpetually happy zombies, and alleviating them of all their anxiety. Yeah. And having lost that sort of satanic ambition, Tom Moore, is pleased to just play around with ideas. He's trying to make his way in the world and doesn't sort of see anything as transformative anymore.
There's a wonderful quotation, you might be able to recall it. He's on the bayou, and he is sort of looking over, and he says, Time is the magic or the mystical element. Yeah. We didn't have it in the old America. We were constantly planning and plotting, and in between meetings we listened to the minutes of the old meetings, and we took a vacation, and he says now we have time to listen. Right. And that's
we listen
important.
And we watch and we wait. Yeah. And in those moments of not frantically trying to use time and consume it to the fullest, Tom Moore builds a community. And in fact, one of the other, this sort of gets back to the politics of the Wayfarer thing. What does he do within this novel? He's approached by a friend of his who helps him out earlier in the novel, who is planning to run for Congress. A black gentleman who is a small businessman, if I remember correctly in the novel, and is planning to run under the old Democratic Party's standard, leaving behind the left, but trying to create some new moderate center. And Tom isn't sure that he believes in the principles that this guy has, but it's about character. He's willing to be the political manager, and not having stepped into politics ever in the novel, really directly. He's willing to be the manager for this guy and sort of lead him back into political life together. I mean, I think it's a beautiful ending. It's probably the most beautiful ending of any of Percy's novels.
Yeah. Think about the lapsometer. I mean, that sort of brings us forward, I think, into a central concern of Percy's in the novels and also in the philosophical essays. And we should mention that as well, which is the distinction he draws between the elegance of science and scientism. Right. And this lapsometer in Love in the Ruins is this attempt of the scientists to sort of exempt themselves from the ordinary and to use their work in very controlling, manipulative ways to posit that science is the only way to know anything of value. Anything else is just merely subjective and personal, but we have the God terms with our science, and we can employ that and use that in various ways. And inevitably what Percy points to is the science is accepting himself out of his own control, but he will have control over others. And this is,
and it's comprehensive too. This is part of what drew me in. Social scientists do this too. This notion that we have the theory that sets the terms of what's acceptable as evidence, and it's usually materialist. Like, if you can't touch it, count it, see it, measure it, it's not real. Which means that morality and things like that get sort of left behind as a sort of outside check on what the scientist is doing, and in its place, utilitarianism rules. Scientific morality is almost always utilitarian morality, and throughout these stories and his essays, Percy is really worried that scientists build this castle of theory and use it to try to sort of colonize the rest of the world as their sort of base of moving into other disciplines and saying, you should understand yourself as a, you think of, sort of bad economics this way, like you should be the creature that finds maximum utility and sort of always seeks the perfect mode of optimization. But I think he's most worried about psychiatry. And this shows up in a way in Love in the Ruins. Tom Moore is a psychiatrist who has a method of zapping us out of our depression. And, just to mention Peter Lawler again, Lawler was worried during his life that someday someone might get it in their head that, well, depressed people get sick more often, and we can't handle the inefficiency in society. So medical plans will now require we be treated for depression. Percy was really worried that the tendency in scientific reasoning was something can't just be normal and sort of, there can't be a range of possible options. It's once something becomes accepted, it can very easily become mandated. This is where euthanasia creeps in the novels too, and that's in Love in the Ruins, one of the central dramas of the story is Tom Moore is trying to save a geriatric patient who is refusing to speak. It's not clear why exactly over the course of the novel, but he's not speaking anymore, and he's engaging in unsocial behavior. And Mr. Ives, the name of this older gentleman, is to be sent to the Happy Isles, a geriatric euthanasia facility where they put an electrode in your brain that zaps your pleasure centers until you die.
Yeah.
And you don't eat, you don't drink, you're just feeling pleasure until you expire. Turns out Mr. Ives, being conditioned and poked and prodded by these medical and scientific professionals, realizes his only element of control is to just refuse to respond to any outside stimulus. And he's sitting there on the stage being talked about during this medical performance where Tom Moore is challenging the doctors that want to send him away. He gives him a little dose from the lapsometer, which calms him down, his rage down. And Mr. Ives tells the main doctors, yeah, I was just mad. I didn't want to be controlled. I want to go and pursue my studies into ancient language. And Tom saves him. But it's implied in the course of the novel that, anyone who gets a little bit of forgetfulness or whose quality of life drops off a bit in old age is sent to one of these facilities in future America. And, when you read some of the works of some of the writings of Ezekiel Emanuel, Rahm Emanuel's brother, who's a medical ethicist, it's horrifying that this is a guy that wants to basically do something like what Percy is afraid of. It'll be kinder and gentler sounding than the way Percy puts it in the novel. The novel is satire. It's meant to frighten us. But there are people around arguing this way.
Well, it's interesting, too. I mean, just sort of bringing this back full circle, if we think about making ourselves fully at home in the world. So we all have this idea of having the healthcare we want when we want it, maximum amount. And we have a difficult way of thinking about the limitations of healthcare.
Right.
And I think that sort of leads to this other conclusion. Well, when you're no longer useful or as useful, we can kind of push you off to the side. I think this inability to think about, just limits and moderation around various goods like healthcare. And so we're all sort of locked into this consumptive approach.
Right. And I think in the novels, one of the recurring elements is several of the novels end with the main characters being involved in palliative care homes, in caring for the elderly and the sick and the dying, and doing it in a whole person sort of way, in caring for their souls as they're about to depart. Instead of this, the other thing I should mention about these happy isles is that these senior care facilities that he describes in the novel are places where the elderly go and behave like college students without the classes. As best as they're physically able to do. And when they're no longer able to live this sort of pleasure-driven life, they shuffle off. In some ways, it's very reminiscent of Brave New World, what he sets out there.
So I want to switch gears here and to talk about Percy's great essays on language, found in The Message in the Bottle. These are deep essays.
They're very
dense. They require some study. What did language, why was it so significant for Percy?
Well, so for him, this began, I think, as a personal thing. He and his wife thought originally they were not going to be able to conceive children, and they adopted a first child. And not that long after, they had a second child, and naturally conceived. And she was deaf. And Percy became obsessed in the early 50s, as I recall, with how Helen Keller learned language. And I think it was bound up partially with what he was reading in existentialism and Catholic theology at the time. But as a call it recovering mania-driven person for that scientism we were talking about, he began to see language as a way of getting scientists to understand the mystery of the human person. So the first thing Percy observed is that it's interesting. People are constantly trying to train chimpanzees and higher apes to learn language. But it turns out if you spend, years training an ape, you can get to about 60 or 100 individual words, not sentences, words and phrases. And they're all based around stimulus and response. So, the ape wants to be fed, so it gives the signal that it wants a banana. So cause effect. The thing is, language doesn't work that way. Anyone who's been around a toddler, you see them picking up words, and then all of a sudden there's this explosion of language and sentences. No one has taught them grammar. No one has taught them formally how to sort of be responding to causes and effects. Language for Percy in human beings is strange because it doesn't seem to proceed from simple cause-effect chains. Language is this hint that human beings are are something special, something creative. And so in some ways he gets around this notion that I think modern psychologists have that dates back in some ways to Thomas Hobbes, that we're just stimulus response boxes. We are creatures with this gift of mental creation, and language is the place that shows forth.
And to name things.
To name things.
Yes, that's important.
Yeah, and for him, the fact that if you try to trace the origin of human language to stimulus effect, cause effect, stimulus response models, you come up with something that seems painfully reductive, that robs us of something. His argument reminds me of what happens in the early pages of Hobbes's Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes basically says we are not creative, we're just
billiard balls
in motion. And that seems to be the logic of contemporary neuroscience when it's applied to language. And Percy rejects all of it. He thinks that the way for science to get real again is to realize that the products of human language and culture are generative. They don't come from the environment that we live within. And for the study of human beings, if you realize that, if you take that seriously, you would have to radically change the way political science, sociology, economics, conventionally understood, do their business. And some scholars, I think, are valiantly laboring in that. But one thing that profoundly turns many people off of social science, I think, who understand this, is this reduction of the human person to environmental responses, to the world we inhabit. And I find, with students over the years, when you teach them social science texts, they'll accept them at face value because they've been taught to read textbooks this way. But if you ask them questions about, well, where does this leave, what fix does this leave the person in? If you see yourself in this box that the social scientist has created for you, what then? So getting back to the question you asked earlier about, what does the scientist do in exempting himself? Well, he doesn't see himself, once he's painted this picture of science, of logic, as a part of the system, when he ought to.
Yeah. Well, Percy would ask the question, thinking about the neuroscientist, thinking about the sociobiologist, can you explain your own activity?
No.
By your own terms. I mean, can you really give an account of what you're doing?
Right. And the example he gives multiple times is of the sort of rigorous Skinnerian psychiatrist who thinks that all culture is relative and there are no more, there is nothing moral, there are just relative values that people choose in life, who is nonetheless a passionate defender of civil rights.
Right. Well, this is something that the puzzle of our day. We will, and you see this in I'll say elite classes in America. You'll see people who insist they are nothing more than highly evolved chimps.
Right.
And then at the same time insist they're autonomous individuals.
Right.
And attempt to reconcile or show,
one of the reasons I love teaching Hobbes is he suggests we're nothing more than this sort of sack of meat with bones that responds to its environment.
Trying to outrun death,
and we'll all fail. And that is not the experience of human beings. We're something more than that. And Percy almost always indirectly tries to suggest that something more should lead us to faith. But he rarely directly gets at that because he wants us to just think it through ourselves and see the ultimate failure of our desire for, spiritual growth apart from a religious tradition, like, people who are going to, pantheism or Eastern mysticism. They're not going to find what they seek, he argues, because these are mishmash theories of the person. They don't provide a full-bodied way of understanding us as thinking, spirited beings who live in bodies, and both need to be cared for.
It is interesting. Jewish people in his novels are a sign.
Yeah.
Are a sign that points to God. I've always thought that's very interesting, the way he uses that. I think Second Coming comes to mind at certain points, the way the Will Barrett thinks through sort of the presence of Jews in this town in North Carolina. But also, in the novel, The Last Gentleman, I think the most deeply autobiographical novel, this young boy that he has been caring for, the protagonist, the entire movie, is now dying at the end, and does desire to become Roman Catholic, and as opposed to what his family understands. His family, I think, is sort of removed from him at the end. They don't really know what to make of this dying son. And then he has the brother, who is in many ways sort of the scientist, wanting sort of a fix. And then there's Barrett, who's there with him at the end.
Yeah. They at least in The Last Gentleman, take that case particularly. This is another one of these cases where the central tension at the end of the novel is grappling with man's death, with the fact we're all headed there, and we Americans have this tendency to flee from it. We send our dying relatives to nursing homes instead of caring for them ourselves. We avoid visiting relatives in nursing homes. And nursing homes are often these very removed places. They're not near children. They're not near. They're not near a real community, and this is a sign too. The Jews are a sign of the reality of God and things that have been done in the world that we can go in history and look at. But for Percy, these things that Americans do in relation to death, the obsession with health, the obsession with safety.
Gated communities.
I
want to get into, so we talked about at the beginning of this interview, we can't limit him to being a Southern Catholic novelist, and yet the South shapes Percy. We can't understand him without the South.
Yes.
And so he writes a lot of interesting essays about the New South, which he sees. He dies in 1991 from cancer. But he saw the prosperous New South. I grew up in the prosperous New South outside of Nashville, Tennessee. So his essays here I'd purchased with me, thinking about so the gated communities, a way to overcome segregation, or a way to overcome, in certain respects, integration, a way to overcome local problems, to sort of hide away. But Percy is formed by the honor culture, or say the dying remnants of the honor culture of the South. Just maybe as we go to it, talk about that and how that shaped Percy, and how that also shaped him in thinking about the New South, which is really just the South becoming more like America, really.
So he gets introduced to the honor culture by his guardian, William Alexander Percy,
who he calls Uncle Will.
Uncle Will. Uncle Will is a very interesting character. He wrote a brilliant book called Lanterns on the Levee, which everything I'm about to say, you could find it there. He believes in a combination of stoicism and honor and duty. It's you will follow the dictates of your class, this sort of elevated group of people who know their place in society and know how they should behave, who are courtly gentlemen and elegant ladies, and everyone has their proper sort of order in society. Walker, came into adulthood with these attitudes of sort of respect and duty being the foremost things in his life, but he found that they too weren't really enough. And in the context of the South, his argument was that honor sort of left the hypothetically religious Southerner standing on the front porch, is the analogy he used, of the church, never fully inside of it, not really outside of it. So the Southerner, he says, has a religious sensibility, but for the most part, they're limiting the power.
This would be the certain kind of an elite Southerner
that
he
certain
knew,
kind of elite
the Percy clan, and
these are folks who didn't believe the church had anything to say about social issues. It could be against gambling, it could be against drinking, it could be against dancing, but it couldn't be something that should transform your whole person. You've got a code of social ethics in your honor to do that, to govern your outward conduct. So for Percy, the Old South is more nominally Christian than a lot of people believe it to be, I think. And as the as this new South, the sort of he worries that it's going to be Los Angelized, which has a particular poignancy for me growing up in the suburbs of L.A. I get what he means, the sort of standardized track communities with nice grids and fears that community will die there because no one can really sort of, he fears, authentically be from those places.
That's right.
But the Southerner, he thinks, is in this peculiar position to see what's wrong with the rest of the country because they've got this lineage of honor. Which lets them understand, say, the motives of, I'd argue, like the Southern sensibility lets you see why terrorists do what they do much more clearly than I think your average educated Northeasterner, because honor has a logic that really is quite different than that of like the liberal bourgeois. Honor. Yeah, I think, honor culture is a violent culture. Yes.
It's a manly culture. It's a prideful, selfish culture in certain ways. One needs to prove oneself, respond to slights, and these can get out of hand.
Yes, exactly.
What are the limitations upon the assertion of honor? Percy sees all of this. I mean, you recount the episodes of the Percy clan faces off against the Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah.
So. So Uncle Will Percy, who soldier in World War I, basically walks right up to the local leader of the Klan and says, if anything happens to my father, there was threat of a kidnapping.
Right.
You're the first man I'm going to shoot. Now, that's honor culture.
Yeah, he and his friends will hunt you down. We won't look for the guilty party. We'll get you. But you also have to understand, Will Percy is about 5'2". He's like 150 pounds. He barely makes the military standards in World War I. And so he said, I was desperately unfitted for war. And yet this is a man who wrote elegantly in Lanterns on the Levee that, well, after you leave the war, what can you do? Can you sue people over a dead cow for the rest of your days? And this was one of Percy's, central preoccupations. Missing out on World War II for him was, I think, a great tragedy because he understood that coming from an honor culture, war and violence have a certain appeal in the American character, and I mean in all men's character. And I think Percy also provides us a window in understanding why that is, in a way that if you read the literature on why wars happen, why men fight, you would never understand it without getting a grip on how deeply held principle, whether it's religious or political, and honor combined make men willing to fight and die.
I mean, it's interesting. The dominant paradigm in foreign policy studies and in, say, the American college is realism,
right?
Which is the attempt to divorce or remove or separate all of the normal reasons or all of the reasons that people tend to understand for why they're fighting and say, no, this is just a particular pursuit of abstracted power of a state. And this is, to my mind, deeply unsatisfying.
Yeah, and I've taught this guy A.J. Coates. I don't know why it's why it's not more often taught in colleges. This book called The Ethics of War, and he has this brilliant line where he says, the problem with realism is that in divorcing a moral understanding from how war is conducted, realism becomes an unrealistic understanding of human life in international politics. I think Percy would get that, but he also, I think, understood some of the things C.S. Lewis said about, what motivates men to fight in war. In The Abolition of Man, Lewis has this line that says, the purely scientific understanding of where values come from can lead you to say society must be defended. What it does not lead you to is, I will volunteer for the army. It might lead someone to say, oh yeah, society should be defended, but why don't you go? Why doesn't somebody else bear this burden?
No, and that's been well noted since 2001, since 9/11. Who is going to fight? It is interesting. I am told anecdotally the officer corps in the Army is heavily Southern.
Yeah, and moreover, I have used Percy as a way of explaining to students for 10 years now that people were, over the course of the Iraq War, everyone was saying, oh, well, there are shortages in recruitment. This is terrible. This shows how terrible the war is and how we can't get anyone to fight. Now, this isn't a comment on Iraq one way or the other. That's a different conversation.
Right.
But what, if you drill down into those numbers, is very clear is that combat arms units never had a recruitment shortage.
The Marines have never had
The Marine combatant units were never, they had to turn people away. In infantry, armor, cavalry, aviation attack units, none of them had problems filling that. It was logistical units, it was signal corps, it was all the guys that you would enlist and never expect to be shot at. Those were the outfits that had a hard time recruiting people. And the thing is, when I taught kids at Georgetown, only a handful of people understood this. They were kids from the South.
Yeah.
And I had one or two people who were prior service kids coming back from Iraq in Army or ROTC who got this. No one else did. And of course, these are the kinds of bourgeois kids whose parents would have been horrified had they suggested they wanted to join the military.
No, that's a good point. Maybe just sort of tying up a loose end on the honor culture. So the problem is long on manliness, long on the importance and the value of individual action, of the significance of your choices,
right,
and meaning, and yet short on justice.
Right, and this is the central problem of race in the New South and in today, is that, to the degree you have an honor culture, you can say things like, I, as a matter of being a noble, grant you what I feel you are due. I can't say, as a matter of justice, though, that all human beings are equally deserving of certain minimum things, or very great things in terms of rights and citizenship and things like that. And that, for Percy, was the great problem of the South, and why it was so hard for white Southerners coming from this honor culture to grant dignity to their black neighbors. And I think it rounds back to why the face-to-face, the coming together with your neighbors, is so important in places of tension where people don't come from a place of equal respect. It's that they have to actually begin to see each other as fully human, for Percy. And that's a hard thing for an honor lover to overcome.
Yeah. To
see their neighbor as equal.
Maybe that's a good way to end this interview. We've been talking with Brian Smith, the new managing editor of Law and Liberty, and the author of Walker Percy and the Politics of the Wayfarer. Thank you.
Thanks.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.